Rand Paul leaned back in his chair, a smug grin playing on his lips. His words sliced through the chamber with the confidence of someone who believed he held the upper hand. Perhaps, he said with mocking ease, Congresswoman Crockett should spend a little more time in a classroom before lecturing the rest of us. The sting of his jab lingered in the air. A ripple of discomfort moved across the room. Lawmakers shifted in their seats. Aides exchanged quick glances, and a few muffled laughs betrayed the arrogance of those who thought the insult had landed. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't fidget, didn't break eye contact. She sat poised, her gaze locked on Paul with the kind of steady calm that carried far more weight than any smirk ever could. Her silence was not weakness. It was warning. The energy in the chamber shifted. Some leaned forward, sensing something was about to happen. The usual buzz of side chatter died down, replaced by a taut silence. Even the clicking of cameras seemed to hesitate, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Paul chuckled softly, mistaking her stillness for surrender. But Crockett's eyes told another story. Behind them was a storm, carefully measured, waiting for the precise moment to strike. And then, with deliberate calm, she reached into her folder. A subtle gesture, but one that made the murmurs return curious, anxious, electric. What was she about to reveal? What did she have that made her so unshaken in the face of mockery? Rand Paul's jab wasn't just a personal insult, it was the voice of an old order echoing through the walls of power. To him, legitimacy came stamped with pedigree, the right schools, the right circles, the right name. Anyone outside that bubble, lesser, disposable. And in that moment, his mockery wasn't aimed solely at Jasmine Crockett. It was aimed at every voice that had ever been told they didn't belong. But Crockett was no stranger to that dismissal. She had lived it, fought through it, and risen despite it. She didn't arrive in Congress as a polished heir to privilege. She came as a fighter born from real struggle, carrying the weight of communities that had been silenced for generations. To belittle her education was to belittle the very people she represented, the single mothers, the overlooked workers, the immigrants who built their lives without elite invitations. And that was why this moment mattered, because this wasn't just Paul smirking at one woman. It was a system, centuries old, trying once again to put someone back in their place. Yet this time, the target wasn't bowing. She was staring it down with fearless composure. The chamber seemed to realize it too. The air thickened, restless. Every lawmaker, every reporter, every aide knew instinctively that something bigger than an insult was unfolding. It was the question that haunted politics itself. Who decides credibility? The gatekeepers of privilege, or those who had clawed their way here through lived struggle? Paul leaned back, exuding the comfort of entitlement, certain he had already won. But across from him, Crockett's silence spoke louder than any comeback. It carried the weight of an entire generation no longer willing to be dismissed. To understand. The smirk on Rand Paul's face, you have to understand the man behind it. A physician turned politician, Paul had carved his identity as a contrarian, a so-called independent thinker with a libertarian streak that often set him apart from both parties. In the early days of the Tea Party movement, he was its poster child standing on stages railing against big government, warning of fiscal cliffs, and wrapping himself in the language of freedom. But freedom, in Paul's hands, often came with an asterisk. It meant the freedom of the wealthy to hoard more, the freedom of corporations to skirt responsibility, the freedom of entrenched power to remain untouched. for those struggling to get a seat at the table, the marginalized, the voiceless, the communities left behind that freedom rarely extended their way. And Paul, from his perch of privilege, rarely seemed to notice, or worse, he noticed and dismissed them with a wave of smug intellectual superiority. That superiority was his aura, his shield. He relished being the man in the room who could quote libertarian thinkers, who could reduce decades of civil rights struggles into abstractions about limited government. To his supporters, he was the rebel academic. To his critics, he was the arrogant gatekeeper who turned empathy into weakness and equity into excess. And then came the contradictions. Paul, who styled himself as the champion of individual liberty, had a long history of belittling those who dared to define liberty differently. He scoffed at the idea that systemic barriers might still exist. He bristled when confronted with the raw realities of racial injustice. He wielded the language of freedom, yet so often, it seemed, only to deny it to those whose stories didn't match his ideology. That was the Rand Paul, who sat across from Jasmine Crockett, amused, certain of his intellectual dominance. To him, mocking her education wasn't a cheap shot. It was a reaffirmation of the hierarchy he believed in. Those like him on top, those like her clawing for credibility. His smirk wasn't just personal disdain, it was centuries of elitism, condensed into one expression. But Paul had underestimated something. In his world, debate was a contest of wit, pedigree, and polished rhetoric. In Crockett's world, debate was survival, proof carved from struggle, evidence earned through experience. And where Paul saw a young congresswoman to be mocked, he had failed to see the steel in her silence, the calm before her storm. Asterisk before Jasmine Crockett ever set foot in Congress, she had already fought battles most politicians only read about in textbooks. She wasn't born into dynasties of power, nor did she inherit a last name that opened gilded doors. What she carried was grit, sharpened by years of proving that a black woman from modest beginnings could not only survive in a world stacked against her, but thrive in it. Law school was the first crucible, while others coasted on family networks and financial safety nets. Crockett juggled jobs, late nights, and the constant whisper of doubt from those who looked at her and quietly assumed she didn't belong. Professors praised her sharp arguments, but classmates, some echoing the same elitist undertones, Rand Paul would later weaponize questioned her legitimacy. Yet every exam passed, every case studied, every lecture survived became another brick in the foundation she was laying for herself. Then came the courtroom. Crockett didn't enter the law to bask in prestige. She entered it to defend the voiceless. She took on cases others turned away from, clients who couldn't pay, communities that had long been written off. In cramped offices with flickering lights, she fought for justice with nothing but determination and a stack of legal pads. Judges underestimated her. Opposing counsel smirked at her. But time and again, Crockett dismantled their arrogance, not with theatrics, but with airtight arguments and a relentless commitment to truth. There were moments when the weight of it all pressed hard, nights when the bills loomed larger than the victories, days when exhaustion felt permanent. But every trial honed her edge. Each dismissal of her worth only pushed her deeper into purpose. She didn't simply defend clients. She defended the principle that justice should not be rationed by wealth, race, or status. Her activism grew from those same convictions. Crockett wasn't the kind of politician who parachuted into communities during campaign season. She was on the ground, listening, marching, strategizing with grassroots organizers. She knew the sting of systemic barriers because she had lived them, and she knew the sound of empty promises because she had heard them too many times. That knowledge gave her a fire that couldn't be faked. Still, the labels trailed her. Too young, too bold, too unpolished, too much. The whispers followed her into legislative chambers, just as they once trailed her in law school hallways. But Crockett had long since learned the power of turning those dismissals into fuel. She wasn't there to perform respectability for those who doubted her. She was there to fight for the people who believed in her. So when she stepped into Congress, Crockett carried more than a resume. She carried stories of families broken by injustice, of communities ignored by policymakers, of clients who cried in relief when someone finally believed them. She carried the echoes of courtrooms where she had already stood toe-to-toe with men who thought their credentials made them untouchable. And that was why Rand Paul's mockery didn't rattle her. She had heard it all before, just dressed in different words, spoken by different mouths. To Paul, his insult was a clever jab. To Crockett, it was just another reminder of the gatekeeping she had spent her entire life tearing down, because every late-night study session, every sneer in the courtroom, every underestimation had been preparing her for this stage. Congress wasn't a new battlefield, it was just a bigger one. And she had walked in already armed, already tested, already ready. So when Paul leaned back in his chair, smirk curling across his lips, mocking her education, he thought he was landing a blow. What he didn't realize was that Crockett had been carrying something far heavier than his arrogance could measure. She wasn't just sitting in silence, she was waiting. Rand Paul leaned into his performance. The smirk never left his face as he waved a dismissive hand toward Jasmine Crockett. His voice dripped with the kind of superiority that wasn't meant just for Heard, was meant for the cameras, for the headlines, for the sound bites that would circulate in his circles. Frankly, he said, chuckling as if it were all a joke, I don't see why we should take someone like you seriously. Your background hardly qualifies you to weigh in on matters of this magnitude. The words landed like darts, thrown with precision. A few muffled chuckles broke from his side of the chamber. To him, this was dominance, belittling, undermining, mocking until his opponent shrank. But Jasmine Crockett didn't shrink. She didn't flinch. Instead, she met his gaze with a calmness that carried more weight than a shout ever could. When she spoke, her words were measured, each syllable sharpened with clarity. Senator, dismissing me doesn't erase the truth, and it doesn't make your argument stronger. What it does is reveal exactly what you're afraid of, that your privilege is not the same thing as credibility. A ripple moved through the chamber. The air shifted, as if the balance of power had tilted ever so slightly. Paul's grin tightened, just a fraction, but he pressed forward, doubling down with another jab, spoken like someone who's rehearsed a script, but the American people can tell the difference between showmanship and substance. Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. You're right, she replied. The American people can tell. They can tell who dismisses lived struggle as if it's irrelevant, and who actually understands the cost of the policies debated here. They can tell the difference between those who mock and those who fight. Now the murmurs grew louder. Lawmakers shifted in their seats. A few heads turned toward Crockett with something approaching anticipation, as though sensing she was building to something bigger. Paul, however, kept pressing his tone sharper, his words laced with the arrogance of a man who had rarely been forced to back down. But Crockett was unshaken. Every time he tried to cut her down, she answered with precision. she didn't match. His sneer, she dismantled it. And with each exchange, the room grew more electric. Even those who weren't aligned with her politically leaned in. Sensing history had a way of sneaking into moments that began just like this. Then, just as Paul launched into another sneer about credentials, Crockett shifted in her chair. Slowly, deliberately, she leaned forward. The chamber hushed instinctively, as if everyone knew that something was about to break. Rand Paul leaned in. His tone sharpened to a knife's edge. If you're as credible as you claim, Congresswoman, prove it. Don't give us lofty speeches, give us something real. Otherwise, this is nothing more than performance. He crossed his arms and leaned back, convinced the demand would corner her. The smirk returned, smug and certain. Jasmine Crockett didn't rush to respond. She sat still, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her eyes fixed on him. The silence stretched long enough that even the cameras seemed to lean closer, waiting. The chamber fidgeted, papers shuffled, throats cleared, but Crockett remained steady, letting the weight of Paul's arrogance fill the room. Then, with a calmness that felt almost dangerous, she said, "You want proof? Fine." She reached into a folder at her desk. The sound of paper sliding against paper was suddenly deafening in the hush. "Since you've questioned my credibility, Senator, perhaps we should revisit yours." She pulled out a transcript, crisp and undeniable, and placed it on the desk. In front of her, the bold title caught the eyes of those sitting closest. Internal recording, Rand Paul's office. Gasps rippled immediately. Paul stiffened, his smirk faltering. Crockett continued, her voice unshaken. "This is a transcript of a conversation from your own staff. And for the sake of clarity," she tapped the paper, "we'll let the audio speak for itself." From the speakers, a voice crackled to life. Paul's voice, clear, unambiguous. The recording played him dismissing ordinary Americans as too uninformed to know what's good for them, mocking grassroots activists as noise that doesn't matter, and, most damningly, admitting that much of his public performance was just that performance. The chamber froze. For a moment, no one breathed. Then came the gasps, scattered at first, then swelling into a chorus of disbelief. Phones shot up as staffers scrambled to confirm what they were hearing. Some members covered their mouths. Others exchanged stunned looks. Paul's face drained of its certainty. He tried to laugh, but the sound caught in his throat. That's out of context," he sputtered, but the audio rolled on. His own voice cutting him off, exposing hypocrisy after hypocrisy. Each word was a hammer blow, shattering the image he'd so carefully curated. Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't need to. She simply waited, her eyes never leaving him, the quiet power of her stance making the recording hit even harder. When the audio clicked off, she leaned forward, her tone soft but cutting. "This is the difference, Senator. You rely on performance, I rely on truth. And truth doesn't need a smirk to survive." The chamber erupted, not with cheers, not yet, but with murmurs, with whispers heavy with awe. It was the sound of a room recalibrating its perception in real time. Paul fumbled with his papers, his composure cracking, his eyes darting desperately for an escape. The arrogance that once filled the chamber had evaporated, replaced with the undeniable sting of exposure. For those watching, inside and beyond those walls, the moment was electric. People who had been dismissed, talked over, or mocked by gatekeepers saw themselves reflected in Crockett's calm dismantling of arrogance. Her proof wasn't just about Paul. It was about validating every voice that had ever been told it wasn't enough. Paul tried once more, his voice thin. "This is political theatre, nothing more." But the words rang hollow, a desperate attempt to reclaim ground already lost. His voice no longer carried authority. It carried panic. Crockett's reply was simple, devastating. "No, Senator. This is accountability. And accountability is the one thing you've never been able to dismiss." A final silence blanketed the room, heavier than any words. The chamber had just witnessed a takedown so precise, so undeniable, it didn't need embellishment. It was the mic drop moment, not loud, not brash, but searing in its finality. And yet, as the echoes of that recording lingered in the minds of everyone present, the story was far from over. Because while Rand Paul faltered inside those walls, the real storm, the one that would ripple across the nation, was only just beginning. Asterisk the moment Jasmine Crockett pressed play on that recording. It wasn't just the chamber that shifted, it was the entire national conversation. Within minutes, the clip hit social media, flooding feeds with disbelief, admiration, and outrage. Hashtags exploded across platforms. Hashtag Crockett exposes Paul. Hashtag truth over spin. Hashtag mic drop moment. The video was clipped, subtitled, and shared at lightning speed. One post read simply, "History was made today." Supporters rallied instantly. "She said what needed to be said," one user tweeted, their post amassing thousands of likes within the hour. Another wrote, "Crockett just spoke for every one of us who's been dismissed or mocked by those in power." The words struck a nerve, resonating with communities who had long felt unseen in the political arena. But critics weren't silent. Paul's defenders accused Crockett of disrespecting the Senate and ambushing a colleague. Conservative pundits painted her as reckless, claiming the use of a secret recording was beneath the dignity of Congress. Yet even their outrage seemed to fuel the fire, keeping her name trending and ensuring the moment could not be ignored. Late night. Hosts wasted no time. One monologue opened with a split screen of Paul's smirk and his faltering face as the recording played. The punchline, he asked for proof. She gave him proof. Maybe next time he'll just stop asking. Laughter echoed across living rooms. But beneath the humor was a shared recognition of something deeper. The balance of power had shifted, if only for a moment. Celebrities weighed in too. Activists, actors, and musicians reposted the clip, adding captions like, "This is what courage looks like," and "Receipts. Always bring receipts." Political commentators across networks dissected every second, debating whether this was a tactical masterstroke or a dangerous precedent. Regardless of perspective, everyone agreed the confrontation could not be dismissed. For everyday people, though the significance wasn't abstract, it was visceral. "She spoke for us," a teacher commented on Facebook. "For every woman who's been told she's not good enough, for every community that's been belittled, she stood up and proved we belong." A factory worker posted, "On TikTok, I've been ignored by politicians my whole life. But when I watched her, I felt seen." In barbershops, coffee houses, and classrooms, the recording became a touchstone. It wasn't just about politics anymore, it was about dignity. It was about the thrill of watching someone turn arrogance into silence, of witnessing truth pierce through layers of spin. For many, Crockett's mic drop moment symbolized the possibility that the powerful could in fact be held accountable. Even those who didn't follow politics closely found themselves drawn into the conversation. The clip was simple enough to require no explanation. A man mocks. A woman listens. Then, with precision, she dismantles him not with louder words, but with undeniable truth. It was cinematic, dramatic, almost scripted in its perfection, but it was real. And so, as the hashtags continued to climb and the memes multiplied, the ripple effects grew stronger. Supporters felt validated, critics felt rattled, the political establishment felt the tremors of a new kind of accountability taking root. Yet, as the noise swirled online and the headlines blared in bold, one truth became clear. This wasn't just about trending hashtags or viral memes. It was about something much larger, something that could not be dismissed with a laugh track or a talking point. Asterisk, when the noise faded and the headlines began to settle, the core of what had happened stood unshaken. Rand Paul's attack was never just about Jasmine Crockett's education. It was about power, about an old guard that believes legitimacy can be mocked, diminished, or waved away with a smirk. Paul played the role of the gatekeeper, convinced that arrogance could substitute for truth. But in that moment, he learned what millions already knew. Real credibility cannot be handed down from a podium, nor stripped away by ridicule. It must be earned through sacrifice, through struggle, and through proof. Crockett's response did more than defend herself. It reframed the entire debate. She didn't match arrogance with arrogance. She matched it with evidence. She didn't stoop to insult. She rose with dignity. And in doing so, she reminded the nation that democracy at its best doesn't belong to those who sneer from positions of privilege. It belongs to those who fight, day after day, to hold power accountable. Her journey, carved from challenges of race, gender, and class, had prepared her for this exact moment. Every courtroom battle, every community she defended, every time she was underestimated, became fuel. In that instant, Crockett wasn't just one congresswoman responding to one senator. She was a symbol of resilience for anyone who has ever been belittled, ignored, or told they don't belong. And the lesson resonated far beyond the chamber. In workplaces, schools, and living rooms, people repeated the same refrain. She showed us that courage matters, that dignity, when armed with truth, can silence even the loudest voices of mockery. That democracy itself depends not on who can talk over others, but on who can stand unshaken in the face of arrogance. Because, at its heart, this clash was bigger than Crockett versus Paul. It was about arrogance versus evidence, spin versus lived truth, a nation deciding whether its future would be dictated by gatekeepers of privilege, or by the people whose lives embody the struggle for justice and equality. Crockett stood her ground, and in that moment she became more than a politician. She became a reminder of what Americanness truly means. Not inherited superiority, but shared dignity. Not exclusion, but equality. Not mockery, but truth. And as the chamber sat stunned, as the smirk on Paul's face dissolved into silence, the lesson became undeniable. Power trembles when courage speaks. Asterisk, Rand Paul thought a smirk and a jab at Jasmine Crockett's education would diminish her. Instead, he was silenced. Not by anger, not by theatrics, but by evidence so undeniable it left the chamber stunned. That was the moment this story became bigger than politics. It became a reminder of what happens when arrogance collides with truth, and truth refuses to back down. This was more than a debate. It was courage backed by proof. It was a message to anyone who's ever been dismissed, mocked, or told they don't belong. Your voice matters. Your struggle matters. And when armed with truth, your words carry power no gatekeeper can erase. But here's the thing, Stories like this only grow when people like you carry them forward. If you believe in voices like Jasmine's, if you want to see truth and dignity amplified above arrogance and mockery, then subscribe to this channel, share this story, and be part of this movement. Because every time we raise these voices higher, we remind the powerful of one thing they can't escape: when truth speaks, arrogance trembles.